I was so excited to invite Dr. John Daigle to come and speak to New England Botanical Society tonight. Dr. Daigle is a citizen member of the Penobscot Nation, and he's also a professor in the School of Forest Resources at the University of Maine at Orono, where he served on the faculty for 25 years, and where he's presently the leader of the Parks, Recreation, and Tourism program. John earned a BS in Recreation Park Management from the University of Maine, and then went on to earn an MS in Recreation Resources and Landscape Architecture at Colorado State University. He completed his PhD in forestry from the University of Massachusetts with a dissertation focusing on the sociocultural importance of fur trapping in 6 northeastern states. He's the recipient of many awards, including both teaching and research awards. Prior to John's 25 years on the faculty of the University of Maine, he held positions as a research forester and also as an outdoor recreation planner at the U.S. Forest Service. So for the past 15 years, he's been working on a project mobilizing diverse interests to address potential threats from the invasive emerald ash borer in Maine. And this is how I was fortunate to meet John in the past year or two. His research seeks to study and facilitate the ways that Wabanaki basket makers, tribes, state and federal foresters, university researchers, landowners, and others come together to prevent, detect, and respond to the threat of the emerald ash borer. So that leads me to the topic of his lecture tonight, which is entitled, Building a Community of Interest and Response to an Invasive Species Threatening Maine's Ash Trees and Wabanaki Cultural Lifeways. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Daigle.
Well, thank you, Melissa. And thanks, Matt, for the beautiful dinner we had this evening and conversation prior to this event. And it's a pleasure to get to know some of you ahead of this presentation. And it's an honor to be here speaking with you tonight to a topic that's really important to me. And as I was sharing with the guests tonight at dinner, you know, something that's kind of ironic when we think about basketry and the threats that emerald ash borer has in killing our ash trees, and really kind of a cultural lifeway when we think about the brown ash. And it really kind of goes back to kind of a lifelong connection I've had. This is my grandparents who made baskets, and I used to help them make baskets in the 70s. When I had my new Nikon camera, I was wanted for taking pictures here and there, and I happened to snap these pictures of them making those baskets back in the 70s. And spent a lot of time with my grandparents in the outdoors doing things, but who would have thunk, you know, that years and years later, I'd be studying this and working with folks to try to sustain ash and kind of this cultural lifeway. It's yeah, I think so. Yeah. Very special. And this is just this is a pack basket my grandfather made that he was pretty famous for. The 70s. Can't quite see the patina, but I use this for collecting firewood and other kind of thing. I do it less now because I don't want to ruin it, but it's very sturdy. And this is another basket that I actually made with them back in the 70s. And I have a few other examples. They were very generous, just giving me baskets and spending a lot of time with them. So, and what's nice, and you hear other basket makers and other community members talk about this, but you know, when you have a basket that's made by a relative, it's very meaningful. It brings you to the place where those trees were harvested, pounded, woven. It's part of my grandparents right there, you know. So it's very pretty powerful. And to get into some of the kind of the cultural importance, I wanted to show a video that's very short. It's Richard Syllaboy, who I've grown to collaborate with at the beginning of this project. And he knew my grandparents, and he was part of the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance that was formed in the 80s, really, it was really trying to reestablish the connection to basket making within the tribal communities and developing a marketing scheme so that, people could earn more money because people earn a lot more money than my grandparents did when they sold their baskets. And it was really that connection when um, the basket makers in Maine heard from the basket makers in Michigan about this emerald ash borer. This is where it kind of initiated. And they contacted the basket makers and said, we've got this invasive insect that's killing the a black ash tree, which is brown ash in Maine. But that's when some of the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance folks reached out to me at the University of Maine to see what could be done and learn more about this emerald ash borer. And that's really where this connection started about 15 years ago, in terms of trying to bring folks together to learn more about this and start to plan around this emerald ash borer. But this person that you're going to see, Richard Silverboy, has been a stalwart partner since the beginning. And you'll see a couple pictures of him later on in the slideshow too. There was a question about the plants that were around the brown ash tree, whether it was ostrich fern. Again, it's a kind of a fiddlehead. It's an edible fern when they are first coming out of the ground. Very nutritious plant. It's one of those superfoods. It's like a blueberry. And so, yeah, so oftentimes you can, where brown ash is located, it's going to be also where you have your fiddleheads are growing. So, yeah. And a kind of like talked about medicine plant. It's a very important plant. Yeah, so that video hopefully gives you an idea of some of the cultural significance associated with ash. That Richard does a much better job than I could do with words, just seeing that. But again, so important, not only just to the Wabanaki tribes here in the Northeast, but for a lot of the northern tribes, black ash trees are a very important species. It happens to be tied to one of our creation stories here in the Northeast, unlike some of the other tribal tribes. But so the cultural significance, the ecological significance is also kind of being seen as being very important. And again, trying to understand when this emerald ash borer first came into the United States, in the early 2000s, there was very, very little research done on ash, particularly black ash, because it's not it's economically important to tribal communities, but it's one of those, what they would call a weed tree in the forestry kind of side of things. It's not, doesn't have a whole lot of economic value, and not a lot of research was built around ash. And so, but there's more and more research that's being done. And one of this is also just finding out the ecological significance of ash. When you're in the woods, and the spring will be coming here in a few months, but what's so unique about ash trees compared to other trees that grow near it? The leaves tend to kind of come out later in the spring, which allows more sunlight to hit that forest floor, right? So that's where the ferns and the other kind of things can grow. It just plays a really important role to other plants and species in that forest environment. It's one of the first trees to lose its leaves in the fall. Those leaves fall, they tend to break down much more quicker than the other leaves of maple and oak, which then gives that nutrient to the soil. So usually where ash trees grow, you have very nutrient soils, which I think supports the other biota that tends to be associated with our ash trees. So just really kind of that ecological significance is important. And the other thing about some of the economic significance, white ash, of course, it has more, for floors and cabinetry and so forth. But for ash trees that line our city streets. That middle shot there is the University of Maine campus. That's the main courtyard. It's lined with ash trees, green ash. And they're just, overall, they're a very pretty tree too. So aesthetically, they're very pleasing. But there's a lot of reasons to like ash, and want to try to keep it as part of our forest environment. This is a colleague of mine, Darren Ranko. He's also a citizen member of the Penobscot Nation, and he's the director of the Wabanaki Center at the University of Maine. But we've been working together for quite some time on this within the community. And again, he's got a TEDx talk on this, but he talks about this emerald ash borer being kind of a wicked problem, and it truly is. It's probably one of the most devastating forest invasive pests that we've seen in ages and ages. And so, as we think about this, and again, we've been kind of working on this for some time now, for 15 years, and I'll talk about some of the more recent efforts, but early on, again, collaborating with folks, particularly some of the tribal communities in Michigan. We had them come to Maine. We went to Maine looking at some of the ash trees that had been impacted by the emerald ash borer early on in our work. Working with the Maine Forest Service to establish a ban of importation of firewood from out of state. Maine was one of the first states in the country to kind of do that kind of legislation. I think it's part of the reason why we probably have more living ash today than some of the other states, but very proactive work, I think, that was done early on. Yeah, this is a purple trap. It's put this woman holding, and that's used for monitoring efforts for the emerald ash borer. You'll see a few more traps later on, but critically important in terms of assessing where EAB is, where it's not, where it's kind of heading. That comes to be important as we start to think about the adaptation management strategies that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. That's me on one of the islands on the Penobscot River on the far end, but next to me, with his hand on the ash tree, was one of the first individuals that had a PhD that looked at brown ash. He got his PhD from the University of Minnesota, but that was one of the few pieces of scientific or science studies that were done kind of looking at ash before EAB arrived here. And he's a Akwesasne State Regis Mohawk citizen member. So like I said, we've had meetings in Michigan multiple times and having them come here, great collaborators, kind of learning of what things are happening there, kind of really informed some of our actions and things to think about here in this region, here in Maine. One of the sad things that was happening in Michigan was that not only were some of the trees being killed, but some of the trees that were still alive, a lot of the harvesters couldn't get access to the trees. Private landowners would not give access to access those trees. So early on, we've been trying to have outreach efforts with private landowners, public land agencies to kind of illustrate kind of that cultural importance of ash. So it still has to be alive. It does, yeah. And so we've kind of made strides in that area where we have outreach with some of the private landowners to try to still have access, because it is going to be a diminishing resource in Maine. There's no doubt about it. But hopefully there'll still be access to practice the basketry that we have, live ash trees, healthy ash trees. Another huge partner is this individual, Les Benedict, who again, Akwesasne St. Regis Mohawk, has been just an important person who we've worked with for years and years. And again, someone like Richard Sillaboy, who was involved with black ash well before even EAB was here in the United States, where again, they were trying to revitalize black ash basket making traditions in New York. He started to work on propagating a black ash seed, wrote a manual, and started to replant some of the black ash that's really informing our methods today. It's going to be really, really key with the work that he did early on. And he was just up in our area last fall with some of the seed collection training that we were doing at Maine. It was pretty awesome. We've had a few colloquiums on black ash, again, because there was just such limited information. But at the University of Maine, we had one of the first colloquiums on black ash, where we had some of the latest work, scientists from Canada, Michigan, Minnesota, other folks sharing their knowledge about the emerald ash borer, the biology, also integrating kind of knowledge from indigenous, very important information about black ash, where it grows, the healthiness, the site conditions, all those things where there was really truly mutual learning kind of going on at these colloquial events. We went out in the field together. It was a lot of fun. And we were able to publish one of the studies in terms of, as a result of that colloquium. And I just have this. This is a colleague of mine who I work with, Nate Siegert with the U.S. Forest Service, who's done, he did his PhD work from Michigan and has been a U.S. Forest Service entomologist. And his work has primarily focused around ash and the emerald ash borer. So he has studies in Michigan and other places, New York. He has now study plots in Maine that's really helping to inform the biology of EAB and the susceptibility of ash trees to EAB, the emerald ash borer. And this is the general cycle or the time when EAB is first detected in some regions. It does, or it's usually even a year or so before it's kind of officially detected. It's kind of hidden in that tree reproducing. But you can see that the crest really doesn't really start to happen in terms of the impact that it has in terms of killing those trees until 5 to 10 years. But then when it hits that mark, you just see it. And I think probably in parts of Massachusetts, some parts of New Hampshire, you've kind of seen some of this. We're probably right in that beginning, because 2018 was when we were first detecting. So we're just right on the cusp of really starting to see some of the impacts that's going to result from the emerald ash borer. So that's kind of the emerald ash density. This is the ash mortality, which is pretty scary, where you have nearly almost 100% mortality in places where you have the emerald ash borer. You do have a few what we call lingering ash that may be present at those sites, which I'll get to, which can be very important to us, but it is a pretty devastating insect in terms of the damage it can create. Other research, as we've learned more about the emerald ash borer and its impacts on different species of ash trees, unfortunately, black ash seems to be the most preferred of all the ash species. When it has its choice, where you have these trees growing together, it tends to congregate more to those black ash than the other ash species. It might be partly due, as we're learning, some of the genetics of the black ash is very closely aligned to the Manchurian ash, where this insect is the native species. So I think there's some exciting research to be done. The black ash just seems to just overreact in terms of trying to protect itself, and it dies much more quicker than some of the other ash trees. But it's genetically closer to Manchurian, which is able to defend itself too. So there's some interesting work, or I think some promising work that might be coming down the road, but we'll see. It just takes time with some of it. But this is just to kind of give you an idea of, again, how research is informing kind of decisions, things that are happening on the landscape that really helps us. And for us here in the Northeast, in some ways we are kind of lucky in the sense that we're kind of on the end of the pipeline where we've been able to integrate more of the research that's been done in the Midwest and other places. In terms of looking at the effects of some of these adaptive strategies on the you can get the minute. Yeah, so that's just indicating that about 1% that may show some genetic level of resistance that we might be able to utilize.
And that's the same thing as what
Lingering ash, yes, yep, yep. So a few years ago, kind of supplementing that work with that we had done in Maine, we had another research colloquium meeting in Vermont a few years ago. Again, kind of bring in what's the latest research, where we should be going in terms of some of our strategies. Very informative meeting. Quite a few people that you see in that group were probably at Maine, but we're meeting again as a group of people in Vermont. And Les Benedict is in that picture too, and some others that you see. But again, this is really important. Staying connected, working together, learning from each other with what's working, where they're kind of losing ground. As a result of that meeting in Vermont, what I think was another kind of iconic development was this kind of cooperation with the Forest Guild and kind of developing recommendations for managing ash, options that could be given to private landowners and thinking through how they might want to manage their ash. Because what we were seeing in other parts of the country was that people were just harvesting all the ash. They knew the AD was going to come. It was likely going to kill all their ash. And so they were cutting all of their ash. Exactly. Some of that could have been the lingering ash. Yep. So these are some of the strategies that are associated with the 10 recommendations. And I have a publication that I have available here that you're welcome to take after my talk today that kind of talks a little bit more about this. It's also available on the website at the University of Maine, where you can get a digital version of this catalog too. So I wanted to give you, again, some sense of things that are happening in Maine, my home state, and some of the efforts that are currently underway. And this is just a map of around 2018, where we first had our first detections in the state of Maine. It actually first came in from Canada up in northern Maine. That was our very first detection. But it had been in New Hampshire for quite some time, but eventually came into our state in 2018. You can see that just coming right over on that border there. This is kind of the current situation. This is a map that was created at the end of December, where we have the red dots are where there are confirmed detections of the MLH4. The blue section there are kind of the quarantine zones in our state. Maine is one of the last states in the country that still regulates the movement of wood to try to slow that spread of infected wood to go into other places of the state. And so that's a more recent expanded quarantine with those with the identification of the MLH4 in the central part of the state of Maine. I don't know if you can kind of make out that those green dots, but that's the basal area of ash. And I think it may surprise you, it really is a pretty small component of our forest. It's less than 4% of our forest, but it really spreads throughout our state in small pockets. It tends to be more concentrated when you see that green in the center that goes right up. It happens to be, unfortunately, right where I-95 goes, where people are traveling, but the three species of ash are white, green, and brown. It's a pretty small component of our forest. White is the most popular ash species in our woods. But again, it's been there it's one of the oldest tree species in Maine. Ash has been there for a very long time. That's why it's connected to Wabanaki music and the culture. This is just an example of some of the monitoring efforts that really need to happen alongside of the quarantine system, right? Where you kind of detect where EAD is, where you might need to expand based on where you have new cases of the MLH4. And this just helps to inform management decisions that you might want to employ related to the MLH4. Typically, in some cases, still, a lot of people still want to get value out of their ash tree, right? So again, you might not want to harvest your ash, and hopefully not all of your ash, but you don't want to harvest your ash where you still have time, you can still grow, have that tree grow. So the idea through these monitoring efforts is that you can maximize that growth of your ash trees by keeping track of where EAD is located.
Are you just especially tracking the purple or is that just people find the fact?
You know, there have been tests, and I guess they decided on that color purple as being best, but you can see the green funnel trap. That's also used for monitoring. But you know what seems to be the best mechanism for detection? What we call trap trees, where you're actually girdling a tree, and that has the natural hormone, you know, the tree is stressed, it's giving those hormones, and we've actually had better detection with landowners who have sacrificed a tree, called it a trap tree. And they've actually been a little more effective than some of these other traps. That trap, an example of a trap tree is on that part. And what I like about that though, is it also gets the landowner involved where they're thinking about their ash. They come to some of the peeling sessions to see if they have MLH4. So I think it's kind of one of the ways we can better engage landowners in terms of that. So I'm going to go through some ash preservation management strategies. Again, some of these have been employed for some time. Some of these still need time to see how well they will work. They probably will work best in terms of thinking how they might be integrated. And so I'm going to go through some of these approaches to, you know, how we might try to preserve ash in our forest settings, even though it's going to be a challenge, right? It's going to be a challenge. And I think we need to be upfront with that expectation because we're going to see an awful lot of dead ash trees in our state before we start to see any type of recovery or hope of recovery. But one of the first steps is to actually do some kind of inventory, know what you have to manage is one of the first steps. In a lot of cases, people don't know what ash they may have on their property. And so knowing what you have to see what your management options might be is one of the first steps. And also thinking through what you might want to monitor just besides the tree species itself. And this is one of my graduate students, Tyler Everett, who as a master's project developed an ash inventory manual. And as part of that manual, it goes through things that you might want to collect for future reference. So when you're doing an inventory of your ash, you identify, you know, the female ash trees, the male ash trees, size class, soil conditions, other aspects that you could use to help you think about other potential strategies, as well as the silvicultural treatments that you might want to consider that you saw with the that you saw earlier, right? So this is just a way of thinking through and becoming more aware of what's in the forest. In a lot of cases, particularly brown ash, where it tends to be in wetland areas, are typically not even inventoried by foresters in development of forest management plans. So in a lot of cases, this is trying to gear up foresters in the development of forest management plans to kind of think through potential strategies if the landowner wants to do that. What could be done to try to address the EAD and try to sustain ash on their property? They need to know what they have to begin with, right? So inventory and monitoring is very important. And as part of Tyler's work, we did some field training with some of the tribal foresters, public foresters, private landowners that wanted to come and learn more about the forest inventory. We did some field training this past year as part of our webinar series and had some in-person field trainings to learn more about inventorying ash. which was very promising to see the turnout for that. So aligned with having that inventory and monitoring of where you have your ash trees is this idea of seed collection and seed banking. And again, you saw that dire illustration, right, of Nate Siegert's work in terms of looking at what happens when you have EAD come into a forest setting where you have pretty much 99% mortality. There's only a short window of time that you're going to have to collect ash. And that was one of the things that he started to share with others based on his research was, you know, here in your state, you still have healthy ash trees, collect it while you can. We've lost that opportunity in some of the places, like in Michigan and other, where if EAB has gone through and they're not able to collect the seed. And so that inventory and the monitoring becomes important because you're not only monitoring for EAB, but you might also be monitoring for when that seed is available to be collected. One of the unique things about black ash is that it does not produce seed every year. It produces seed on a cycle of 5 to 8 years. So you need to be prepared when that seed is being produced to be out there and collecting that seed. So that kind of comes into that inventory and monitoring aspect. That's kind of the integrated piece that I think is.
Before you see the piece flowering earlier in the season, so you know that might be a good seed year.
You can, yeah, early in the spring, you will get some. We had a very good seed year a few years ago. So, and we were able to collect some seed this year, but it's going to be a few more years before we have a crop year of seed. But hopefully, we'll be prepared. We'll have the trained people that want to collect seed, willing landowners, and we're going to be able to collect seed. Hopefully,
so is it like the mass year where obviously decide this is the year we're going to produce seed?
It varies. Yep. Well, of course, by the term mass year, you have a lot of trees producing seed, but even like last year, we had some brown ash that were producing seed, just not nearly as many as the year before. Yeah. But seed collection and banking those seeds, both for long-term storage and increasingly a lot of the tribal communities want to do short-term storage and start to develop a nursery, which I think is also a great idea. And plus with that, you're still retaining live seed production, which I like. So there's a whole strategy associated with some of the seed collection effort. That's really important. And of course, part of that seed collection effort is trying to get different geographic locations in our state for the genetic diversity that exists within brown ash trees. All ash species, there's such genetic diversity that's out there. And this is one way to try to collect that. And again, we owe a lot of credit to Les Benedict with his propagation that he did from seed. And he has been a stalwart person to refer to in terms of some of the seed collection effort and propagation of seed. And he and his partner there have been to Maine. I don't know how many times we've gone to New York, and they're just willing to share their knowledge around the seed collection effort. So again, very, very good partners. There's like some examples of some brown ash seed, and some of the collection efforts. We do have a couple recorded webinars on our website at the University of Maine on some of our seed collection trainings too that's available. We're likely going to have some more seed collection in-person trainings this coming late summer, early fall, in case we do have some seed production. So another aspect as we kind of think about, an integrated approach is thinking through what you might want to do in terms of kind of preparatory work of the emerald ash borer, right? You may have some forest landowners that do not want to do necessarily, they don't really want to do anything. They just want to kind of let their forest grow and see what happens. You're going to have other forest landowners that are going to want to cut and get all value they can out of their ash trees. But then you may want to have some landowners that they can follow some of the best practices, what we're calling best practices. You may need to sacrifice some value because you still want to retain some mature ash on your property. You can still harvest some of your trees, but you'd want to retain some of those mature ash that could potentially produce seed and also be assessed for lingering qualities. So part of this silvicultural treatment is what you kind of leave on that forest landscape. That's important. But also what we're learning, particularly in our Northeast forests, where it's unlike a lot of the Midwest, like Wisconsin and Minnesota, where you'd have pure black ash stands. Our stands are much more sheltered. They're kind of growing amongst a lot of other species.
So that might be spread.
It could potentially reduce the rate of spread. That's one thing that we're hoping. But it does kind of bring in some other things that we need to think about, because this is what we're seeing. For those landowners that are not going to do anything, some of those trees are eventually going to succumb to EAB. And in those areas, what we're seeing is that those other tree species take over. And that it's not able to regenerate. There's just too much cover, too much competition. So part of the silvicultural practices that we're kind of examining right now, Tyler's moved on to his PhD work now, where he's looking at silvicultural treatments, where you're trying to open up that landscape, where you're kind of given a chance for those young seedlings that are already in the ground to kind of grow and be growing when EAB is coming, because the EAB will attack the older ash trees. So you'll have another generation of ash that's coming up behind it. So silviculture really starts to also be kind of an important piece of the puzzle in terms of this integrated strategy. So again, kind of thinking through this, and again, it's not just managing the insect, but what we're really kind of pivoting towards now, especially in the past 5 to 10 years of work, is how can we manage our forests to prepare for the MLS borer. There's still quite a bit of investment in biological controls as a potential piece to the puzzle, but we really got to set up that forest and think through that forest and how that fits in. So that's kind of some of those things that we've kind of talked about here in terms of thinking about the mature, making sure that you have male and female. You've got those trees identified and marked so they're not harvested and those things, right? Kind of have that as part of your forest management plan. The other thing that's a little more controversial is this idea of chemical treatment. And again, a lot of this work was done early on in cities and towns where you had ash trees. And again, there's evidence of this being a viable strategy to try to retain ash in cities, where it actually might cost you less by treating trees versus needing to cut all your trees from the EAB. There's climate benefits. There's other kind of things. There's benefits to chemical treatment where you might automatically think, oh, that's not a good idea. Part of the strategy in terms of thinking about a chemical treatment in a forested setting is the idea that you would still have trees that are producing seed. Kind of a live production seed. And again, it's not like you're going to treat your whole forest, but you'd have these what we're calling preservation patches, where you're still retaining those ash trees as part of your forest, where you may have seed production. There's oftentimes benefit to other trees that are not treated that we're seeing in those preservation patches. So you don't need to treat all of your trees. There's other benefits that kind of come from adjoining trees. And I think what's going to be important here is also just looking at the association of what might be the benefits to other species by keeping those trees alive in your forest versus them being taken away or being removed. The chemicals are targeting just EAB, but again, I think we need long-term assessments, right, of this kind of approach. But I do think it may be another important piece to the puzzle as we kind of think through kind of preservation strategies. So New Hampshire has a number of preservation patches already throughout their state. And for our state of Maine, we're just thinking now of establishing those. And we're in the process of doing that, those preservation patches. So again, this is just a little more detail. I'm not going to go into all of this, but essentially, right, these are injections that take place into the tree. Again, it costs more depending on the size of the ash tree to protect it, but there are different chemical approaches or chemical treatments that you can do. Some are more effective than others. But the ones that are effective are they're very effective in protecting that tree. There's high survival rate of those trees when they are treated.
So you've got to mark those trees too, so you know which ones you treated, which you.
Yes, right, because it's something that you do not need to apply every single year, but you probably would need to apply, in cycles. Again, we can see what might happen if we have more establishment of the biological control. They may not need to be treated forever. But we can see. So chemical treatment. Another adaptive management strategy is the biological control. And again, early on, just like with the Asian longhorn beetle, the first efforts to try to control the emerald ash borer was to try to contain it, try to cut all the trees around, try to contain that and stop it from spreading. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to be as successful with that approach like we have been with the Asian longhorn beetle, like with here in Massachusetts, right? But that just is not in the cards for the emerald ash borer. And so early on, they started to look at other means of trying to control the emerald ash borer through this biological control, which is non-native wasps that predate different stages of the emerald ash borer, through larvae, through the adult, and so forth. So this is, I think it's probably gotten a little more red in terms of spread of where they've applied the biological control, but you can see where this is being applied. And so again, in the past 2 years, with some of the research that has been done on some of the biological wasps, again, we're in New York where you see most of the red. Research studies have shown the biological control following where EAB is going. After it's devastated that forest, it moves on to another part of the forest, that those wasps are following the emerald ash borer, which is a positive. They've looked at the forest health of those trees where you have the biological control treatment versus where you do not have the biological control treatment. You have more trees that are alive or more healthy where you have applied it versus where you have not applied it. So it is, but again, we still need more time to assess the effectiveness, but we are seeing, I think, some promise in terms of the application of the biological control. So when we think of these biological controls, we've got some native biological controls. We've always had these wasps that would go after things. So we've got some, particularly woodpeckers. Woodpeckers are phenomenal birds that predate on emerald ash borer. It took them a few years to identify it as a food source, but now they do, and they're going after the emerald ash borer. So we do have native biocontrols, and we also have these controlled releases of the parasitic wasps that are from China and Russia that are also being deployed to try to balance out the emerald ash borer. And again, with this, I think what's key, and again, in some of our communications efforts, is that we're probably not going to see real benefit until we have kind of a post-EAB situation where it'll be a little more equal ground, I think, where you've got populations of EAB that might match up a little bit more closely with the biological controls. This is the final piece here as we think about kind of an integrated pest strategy is this idea, again, kind of coming back to the lingering ash and the development of potentially more resistant ash trees to the emerald ash borer. And again, because more research historically has been done with white and green, partly because of the commercial value and partly because of the impacts that it's having in our cities and towns, a lot of research is focused on those ash species. And in the development of ash, genetically resistant ash, and that is showing promising results. It takes time to develop those trees, but there are now green ash that can live with emerald ash borer and not die. It took several generations of kind of developing that tree, but they are seeing some results of trees being more resistant to the emerald ash borer. It's primarily with the green and the white where most of that research has been done, and we're trying to catch up a little bit more with the black, which is the most susceptible. So, but we're kind of heading in that direction. And another reason why we kind of feel that we really need to take advantage of the seed and monitoring for that lingering ash while we can is because what we're starting to see is that some of that lingering ash that didn't get impacted by EAB the first time, when it comes back, it's attacking some of those lingering ash. So the research direction is saying, well, take advantage of that lingering ash, but still try to develop that resistance as much as you can, because you can't count on that lingering ash being totally protected, because we're seeing some of that eventually succumbing to EAB. So I think this is another important piece. And so this takes testing, sacrifice of trees to see how long they will survive. Again, if they can survive for a certain amount of time before it succumbs, that's, again, that's development. Yeah, it probably, you know, about that size. Yeah, yeah. So these wouldn't really be impacted. I think one of the challenges we think about our Northeast forest in this type of approach and nursery, and again, I think this is going to be some direction of my research in the coming years. We, as more forest landowners here, have relied on natural regeneration. We've always had very good regeneration of our trees. We've been very fortunate here in this region of the country. And I think this is going to be a little bit of a mind step for a lot of forest landowners to think about planting trees. But I think that's where we're going to need. I think that's where we're going to need to go if we want to try to retain ash in our forests. Is this part? And I think it's going to. We need to do some prep work in this area. It's my thinking. Okay. So, what are some of the next steps? At least for us here in Maine, I think it's still incredibly important that we still have outreach and education, because most of our ash trees are still 100% healthy and alive, most of them right now. So if we can slow the rate of spread of EAB, that's the longer that they're going to be able to survive and maybe linger longer, right? And so that outreach and education is still really, really important. It's going to be more important because we need to pivot from stopping people from coming out of state in to our state, bringing the firewood, to people taking their firewood in their backyard and bringing up to their camp, or bringing the wood from the camp back to their home for heating their homes. So there's going to be a switch to more internal education of Maine, even within Maine, you know, in terms of thinking about don't move firewood, where the Maine Forest Service is starting to restructure its messaging and outreach. This is a study that I did of campers a few years ago, looking at their awareness about the emerald ash borer, their willing, you know, did they bring firewood with them when they came to camp? And again, we were still seeing quite a few campers bringing firewood with them, even when they knew about the emerald ash borer, even though they knew about the potential dangers of the emerald ash borer. And most of those campers thought their firewood was safe. They weren't in the quarantine zone. You know, they were so far, you know, away that, you know, oh, it's fine. I've always done this. And that's something that we have to be really careful about, right? Because in a lot of cases, you do not know your wood is infested, and then you're bringing it someplace else. And so you really kind of need to kind of continue to work on that strategy because it's not just bringing awareness about the emerald ash borer but also the idea that you may not know that you have that emerald ash
Then you
borer.
can say, well, this wood I've brought, it's not ash, so you don't have to worry.
We had some that said that, yeah, yeah. You know, and there were some that purposely left their firewood at home too because they knew about the emerald. They saw the messages. Oh, I saw that sign, or I heard that I shouldn't, so I didn't. But you know, again, you had some other campers. I'm trying to save $5 or $10. I got a limited budget for my vacation. I want to save a few dollars. I brought firewood with me. You know, so you have that too going on. Very interesting study, but more work kind of needs to be done working with campers. And so we go to RV shows, camping shows to kind of do some outreach and education. Get it in some of the Maine camping guides and other kind of things just to try to get that message out. There's new apps where you can kind of locate firewood and other kind of distributors and other kind of things that other states have done, but we're doing it here in Maine as well. But again, at least for me, and with a lot of our homes still heated by wood, where are people getting their wood to heat their homes? And can that be done more locally? Because sometimes you don't even know where that wood's coming from. So that's an emphasis area for us. So again, in terms of thinking through some of the important next steps is inventorying, monitoring ash trees. And again, a lot of these adaptive management strategies is partly dependent maybe on how much ash you have, because you need to have a certain number of ash to consider doing a preservation plot or even doing some kind of silviculture, right? But even if you have 1 or 2 ash on your property, if you can monitor the health of that ash tree, that informs other people that might have more ash on their lands. So no matter what level you have in terms of ash, if you know you have ash on your property, you can do some monitoring that could be very helpful and become involved in efforts. You know, a lot of our landowners don't have formal management plans, but again, they like their forests. And but they can still be involved even though they may not have a formal management plan, which I think is important as we want to try to get more involvement with landowners. But I can say with a recent survey of landowners that there is a surprising amount of interest in wanting to try to retain ash in their forests. There's a surprising amount of landowners who, once they learn more of the cultural value of ash and cultural lifeways associated with the tree, motivates them to want to take action to try to protect ash and even in some cases provide access. And so I think what we're going to start to see too are landowners, when they're working with a forester, if they have a forest management plan, asking the forester, if I have ash, what are my options? What could we do here? And so the past year and a half, we've had surveys that have gone out to private landowners, and we've also had surveys that have gone out to foresters and loggers to kind of look at their assessment about EAB and some of their practices and their decisions that I think is important part. Again, and also thinking through our future seed collection effort, particularly when we want to try to collect that seed when it is available and also try to get that genetic diversity that's going to require a geographic range of where those trees are growing. And basically trying to create more opportunities for landowners, you know, having them be able to make decisions. What decisions can they make? What fits for them is something that's important. So just a few more slides. I just wanted to circle back to this because this was just briefly showed on that video, but that's a picture of Richard Siliboy on this old, I've got this Maine Indian basket makers poster that the executive director gave me a copy of that poster. I kind of split up into 3 pieces, but this was before the emerald ash borer was discovered, but this was through the efforts of the Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance. And that's Richard Siliboy that was part of the early Maine Indian Basket Makers Alliance that one of the things that organization was able to do was to kind of form as an entity, because what they were starting to see was decline in brown ash health. This is before EAB, but they were seeing declines in brown ash health that was impacting the usability of the ash tree.
That's the other factor.
It just forced, yeah, it's a combination where you'd have a dieback. It doesn't kill the tree, but you'd have dieback that was occurring in the tops of trees. And it just made it less usable for making baskets. You pound it, you start to peel it, and it would just splinter. And so Richard brought scientists out to these places and kind of showed these examples, and they did the pounding, they did the other things that kind of brought together the Maine Forest Service, some scientists, the University of Maine, and that really kind of laid the groundwork for when I started at the university. NEBA came to me, but there was already a relationship that was started between tribal communities, the university, the Forest Service, and I brought in the Federal Forest Service. But again, there was already that trust, which I think is really important as we kind of think about collaboration. And it just amazes me because, again, you talk to some, you see someone who is so committed to this tree, who has his whole life, basically. It's just amazing. And that, it's an honor actually working with him and others that have been associated with the tree for so long. And I just wanted to put up this slide because some of you had mentioned Robin Kimmerer. I'm a real fan of her as an author. But, she notes, and I totally agree with this, it's really the act of doing, right? It's doing the cultural practice. If you can't do it, how can you instill that in your values, meaning, identity? You need to have that, you need to implement, you need to do it, right? And again, that's why I see some value when we think about some of the nurseries where you're having trees that you're regrowing, maybe bringing those trees to those site conditions that grow quality brown ash trees from the knowledge keepers. You're trying to keep that connection, that knowledge alive. That's important. I think it's really important as we think about sustaining cultural lifeways, these kinds of things. And in fact, thinking of him, here he is right here, who I've worked with for quite some time. And one of the things that he talks about, which again, very insightful, but it's so true. This emerald ash borer has really been a real threat to our culture. Very scary, but it's also been a mechanism for tribes really kind of coming together and working together more than probably we have in quite some time. And he appreciates that. I think other people do too, but he says it, it has been a mechanism, even through all its badness, there's some goodness that's coming out of it too. I think it should be recognized. That's Richard. We've gone out on a field tour on some Nature Conservancy property in Maine, again, where they're strong partners and wanting to provide access to brown ash for basket making. Again, unfortunately, this site we went to, Richard didn't see any high quality brown ash for harvesting. And that's the thing that people need to realize, again, with, trees that are used for making these baskets. In some cases, it's probably 5% of, when you're looking at various areas. You can survey this property and then none of that brown ash is really suitable for the black ash. But where it is suitable for black ash, it tends to be a very small number, right? And so they're also surprised how few trees that you extract from that property, that kind of qualify, for making baskets. And I think they're surprised by that. They think that, oh, you're gonna take all my trees, that kind of thing. That's not the case. So it's very informative situation too for landowners when we have the basketry harvesters out there with them. Okay, and I just have a couple more slides because I had quite a few to show you. But this is just the landowner survey that we're doing, that we've done, and we're analyzing the results. And I'm so pleased to see some of the findings and interests on a broad scale throughout the state of Maine. Large landowners, small private landowners, conservation entities that want to become involved or learn more about managing ash on their property. They're also giving us some sense of what it might take for them to become involved. in terms of financial incentive or maybe some special programs and other kind of things. But it's really, I think for the most part, it's a really informative information that we've got from private landowners that we're going to be able to share with foresters and the professional forestry community when they're working with their landowners. They're going to, I think, be surprised how much their landowners are interested in maybe doing some silvicultural treatment or other things. So that's a big piece. Staying connected is another. We're going to have a brown ash colloquium that we're planning for this fall at the University of Maine. We're going to kind of continue that tradition and have a fairly large meeting this fall. Bring scientists, bring tribal harvesters together this fall. We're hoping to have, we did have high Canadian participation at our event at the University of Maine the first year, and we're hoping to reestablish that, have a little more heavier presence of Canadian foresters and tribal folks come to Maine this fall with our colloquium event. But it's a pretty strong community, and I'm hoping that we can kind of sustain that as we go forward. And so this is just a small piece of partners. This is certainly growing. The Maine Wild Seed Project, which I was talking about at the dinner tonight, many others who are becoming partners in this effort, but I think this list is going to certainly continue to grow as we go. And like I said, I do have this our publication that we worked on this year, of the end of this past year. And what I really like about this is that it's authors, myself and Tyler, but then you've got the University of Massachusetts, University of Vermont, Harvard Forest, St. Regis Mohawk Tribe. We've got a regional kind of representation here of efforts that we want to try to get more out in the field to educate landowners. So our kind of collaborators are kind of growing, and the interest is there too, which I think is really cool. So these are free if you want to come get one after this. And this is available too in digital form from our APCA website, which I think is listed on the program. So you can, there's this and the recorded webinars, upcoming events that we're going to be having. I'd love to see your faces on future webinars that we might have going on this coming year too. So yeah, so with that, I think I can stop here. Oh, I had just one little one there. Willie Wan, thank you. And this is a picture of a slide that I took of someone else's slide at a conference years ago. But the mechanical properties of black ash, the greatest properties of black ash: teaching patience, providing for families, carrying traditions, fulfilling ceremonies, speaking for people, providing medicine for healing. I think that's pretty cool. Thank you. Because there have been some efforts, experimentations that have been done where they've actually submerged logs to see how long they can survive, you know, with the EAB. And already we have basketry harvesters harvesting harvesting more than they could use in a given year, but they're freezing it. And that by freezing, it can last for years. They're already testing how long it can last for. And freezing does have a little more advantage than soaking. The soaking will kind of discolor the wood. It can still be usable, but it's skin. But yeah, you're right. There can be other things that we could be doing that to try to save some material that could be used for the future that I think, you know, is important. There, again, we have some mechanical pounding machines that have been used for years and years by certain harvesters. Some traditionally pound by hand, like my grandfather used to do. But I met this individual in New York at Akwesasne. He was an engineer for one of the Michigan car plants or whatever. He created this pounding machine where he could sit down and load automatically this stick of ash, pound it, move it around. He didn't, you know, and he could process quite a bit of ash. He processed quite a bit of ash for other community members with that machine that he created. So yeah, kind of thinking through how we might be able to utilize some of that ash before it's not usable is a great idea. there was a question about the potential implications of using that pesticide treatment as being something negative in terms of impacting pollinators and other kind of species associated with that. And all I can say is that there's been quite a bit of testing associated with this pesticide, where I think they've been able to show that there's been very limited impact to pollinators because of, one, it's injected into the tree, the timing of when it flowers. There's other things that are kind of calculated in where they haven't seen that effect to other species, which I think a lot of people kind of naturally think could happen. But there is some literature out there to help you learn. Some people can learn more about this, and then they can make an informed decision. Well, maybe it's still not high enough for me to decide, but there are studies that are being done to try to assess that as best they can, so people feel comfortable if they want to do that. Yeah, so people are asking when the seed is ripe, when you should harvest your seed. And so again, Les would be the most appropriate person probably to answer that question. But typically you're looking for the seed collection to happen probably late summer, early fall. You want to have that seed mature, but you don't want it to have it mature or wait be on there long enough so that you get weevils in it. So whenever you're collecting that seed, you're going to be collecting the viability of that seed. And there's ways that you can do that. If you send it to some seed banking facilities, they will do that checking for you. They'll check that viability of the seed for you before they store it. Well, actually, to take that back, it depends on where you send your seed to be stored. Some places will, one place is called the Black Box, which I think is in Denver. They'll just store your seed for long-term storage, but they will not check the viability of your seed. One of the places where we're sending our seed is in Iowa, where it's a national seed center, where they will check the viability of the seed to ensure that it's okay. After a certain amount of time, they will regrow that seed and so that you have that fresh seed. You're not relying on that seed to be viable after 100 years. But you also are giving that seed available for others to do research on that seed. So there's some trade-offs, but that's the direction we're kind of going with our seed. Yeah, yep, again, yep, because again, some of the ideas would be that once you've had this massive outbreak and kill off, and they're going on to other trees to kill, does it just keep going? Does it not come back? Unfortunately, it does come back. It does stay within that region. And why you're seeing those little ups is that you do have some trees that are eventually growing to be old enough for it to be susceptible to EAD. So unfortunately, in a lot of cases, if you only have so many seed years, that's sometimes referred to as the orphan cohort, where once you've lost your seed bank in the soil, you're going to lose that ability to produce seed. That's why we're coming back to the nursery stock and maybe the need for replanting in some sites where you had ash trees growing before. But again, with some of those silvicultural treatments, if you're opening up that space, you're getting more tree seedlings growing. And again, part of the idea here too is examining the effects of the influence of the biological control, where to see, can that make a difference, where you might be able to have some stay longer and not be so susceptible to the EAD. Yeah, so that's a good question. Hopefully I answered it.
Yeah.
Okay. We did have another information session with some of the tribal harvesters there in Michigan. And believe it or not, they were actually still able to find some really healthy ash trees in Michigan in some locations. So there seems to be, I don't know if they had that lingering quality. I hope they are able to collect some information from those trees that are still healthy. But again, it's a little more rare, but there's still live ash trees in Michigan, even though it's been there for so long. But in some places where, Nate Siegert has done his work where, well, is there still, you might have some trees that are still alive, but are they healthy enough, or do you have a number of them where you have seed production? Is that going to be a long-term, is it going to be viable? That still is kind of being assessed in Michigan. Yeah. Michigan is like the hot spot, right? It's kind of that beacon that kind of is giving clues as to what we might see. It's the epicenter, right? Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, so when we're thinking about the silvicultural treatments that we might have in terms of opening up that forest floor, thinking that we might create more space for ash trees to grow, we definitely need to be concerned about how much invasives is in that forest to begin with and what competition is going to be there if you do open up that forest floor. So that is a great question. So that would be one thing that you'd want to assess, with a forester or whoever, in terms of thinking through your silvicultural treatment. And not only invasive, but how much deer population you have. Because there's a heavy predation that can also happen. So you kind of need to think through those things in your strategy. One thing I think that would be valuable as we think through nursery stock is the ability to grow those trees to a certain size so that you can get above some of those invasives. That I think would have some advantage. So, but that's a great question because that's something that you're going to want to certainly consider. There's been various experimentations that have been going on, primarily by the U.S. Forest Service in kind of the Midwest area, and again with white and green. I think what's so promising though, now that we're at least seeing with the green, is the possibility of developing more genetic resistant that's all native, which would be the ideal solution, right? Yeah, but again, kind of time will tell, especially with black ash, because we're just starting in that area with the black ash. But my green would be that hopefully you'd have some development of resistant ash trees that would be localized to where they were initially. That's why you get that genetic diversity out there. You find those that tend to be more resistant, but try to keep it local if you can. I do have another student, Suzanne Greenlaw, who looked at site conditions for black ash, working with traditional harvesters, looking at what soil site conditions are associated with the development of black ash, quality black ash. And she was actually able to develop a model, a predictive model where ash should be growing. It would go there and not see it. And it could partly be due to maybe deer pressure, but what she found out was it was areas that were used for farming. It was changes in that landscape that changed the forest makeup, where ash probably could maybe still grow today, but it's just kind of been taken out, and other things are growing there now, which I thought was very, very interesting. So please get in touch because yeah, we're developing that network. Because other folks like in Vermont and other places, they're going to be collecting seed as well. So we're trying to coordinate that, and we're also just trying to get a real good sense of where we have collected seeds and where we need to collect more if we've got gaps, if we're trying to capture that genetic diversity. So I'm really pleased to hear that you're interested in doing that. The thing about black ash that just makes it unique from other like green, white, and all the other ash species. If you think about, Richard talked about, the yearly annual growth layers, but what's happening, if you think of these two things, you have early growth, the beginning of spring, that gets you to summer, and then you have late growth. That makes up your annual ring. My top finger here, it can vary in width, right, based on site conditions, but that's the early growth. And what's unique about black ash and that early growth ring is the porous membranes. It can be just as thick as your late growth, but it's so porous when you pound it, it crushes. It crushes it down to your late wood. And then if I had another, so if I had like this is, two, so you're crushing the early growth till you hit your late growth, which is more resistant. That breaks the fiber for your next annual growth, which is your porous ring, and then your late growth, which is the hard resistant. So you get these layers that kind of come off, and you can peel those into very fine layers too. But that's kind of a dynamic that's happening when you pound it. It separates. And for many other woods, you don't have that separation effect. And it's partly due to that early growth and late growth that happens in black ash that doesn't happen in the other ash trees or other species. That makes it just a special, unique tree. We tried pounding Manchurian ash, and it's not as good as brown ash. So even though they're genetically close, They're not the same. It doesn't have the same qualities. Some, we had a pounder try it. You could pound it, but it just, the quality was not there. It just didn't have quite the same characteristics. We're working with Jennifer Cook and some other folks with the US Forest Service that's kind of leading that effort. Kathleen Knight has also been involved in that work. We had them actually do a webinar as part of our APCOS series this past year. But again, I think we just need to have more communication and thinking through this, right? When we think about genetics, genetic modification, and just working kind of collaboratively with that work. And thinking through maybe potential trade-offs or whatever, you know what I mean? I can tell you that for a lot of the communities, the use of chemical treatment was really thought, at least with Akwesasne, St. Regis Mohawk. Initially, they did not want to do that, but now they have, because they've seen the threats that are posed to the ash trees. So they've kind of accepted and are using chemical treatment as part of their testing of their adaptation management strategy, along with biological wasp and other things. They're actually one of the, I'd say, one of the really key locations in the country that's really applying an integrated adaptive management approach that's happening in northern New York right now. That's really going to be a model for how we see things happening in other places. And I think partly Les Benedict is kind of leading that charge, right? But yes, so those are important questions, things that need to be communicated and discussed right at a community level, right? Yes, I think that's so important.